Namaste and greetings. I, Arunima Marva, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today we are gathered for a special discussion on informal leadership and development in India's urban slums by Dr. Adam Auerbach. This deliberation is a part of the State of Cities #City Conversations series and is organized by Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies, CHURS, IMPRI. The moderator for our deliberation and our City Conversation series is Dr. Soumyadeep Chattopadhyay. Sir is an associate professor at Visvabharati Santi Niketan and a visiting senior fellow at IMPRI, New Delhi. We are glad to have you here. Welcome to the session. Our esteemed speaker for today's talk is Dr. Adam Auerbach. Sir is an associate professor at the School of International Service at American University. His research focuses on local governance, urban politics, and the political economy of development with a regional focus on India. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
Moving to our esteemed discussants for today, we have with us Dr. Pushpa Pathak, who is a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. We are honored to have you, ma'am. Welcome to the session.
Thank you.
We are delighted to have with us Dr. Lalita Kamath, who is an associate professor at the School of Habitat Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, TISS, Mumbai. We welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Now I invite our moderator, Dr. Chattopadhyay, to initiate the talk with his opening remarks and to proceed with the deliberation further. We look forward to learning from the esteemed gathering. Thank you.
Thank you, Arunima, and good evening to all of you from Shantiniketan. On behalf of the charts at IMPRI, I welcome you all to this City Conversation series. These charts, we started this series in 2019, and the aim is to invite the urban experts and practitioners to discuss and deliberate on diverse issues related to urban developments, urban policies, urban policy making and policy implementation. And we are fortunate to have with us renowned urban experts from different countries sharing their ideas, which are very useful to better understand the contemporary urban challenges and some plausible pathways to overcome them. And today's topic, informal leadership and development in India's urban slum, is very interesting. And urban population in India has been rising rapidly as millions of migrants are moving to the urban areas, aspiring for higher earnings and better living. And the slums are often the first destination of the rural urban migrants. The number of urban poor is also growing. A significant number of these poor find spaces in slums and continue to struggle for better living standards. The slums, as we all know, exhibit sort of uneven access to public goods. And we need to understand why and how this happens. And failure to solve the problems in urban slums is not only an issue of human deprivation, but also an impediment to India's strive for economic growth. So how to respond to this problem? It is well known that that the public resources for urban services are limited and accessed through a complex wave of political relationships. In fact, there are a number of important questions. The answer to some of them are not yet properly understood. For example, why do some slums have better provisioning of urban services than others, or like why it is that some communities are able to successfully demand the provision of public goods, which while the others fail. So there are heterogeneities among the slum dwellers living in the same slum, across the slums in the same political jurisdiction, or between the slum dwellers and some more affluent communities in the same area in terms of their access to basic services, in terms of their ability to demand services. So there is a literature emphasizing on this clientelistic relationship between the politicians and the poor voters. Politicians often acting through their agents like slum lords or local leaders. They provide voters with goods and services which they cannot access through the normal bureaucratic system in return for political support. Partho Chatterjee expresses one specific version of this view when he argues that the poor work through the political channels, whereas more affluent citizens, they stake their claims through directly engaging with the bureaucracy and the government agencies. Even this does not mean that every slum dwellers, they will have access to every services he or she wants. Given the city's limited budget, it may not be feasible to match the demand and supply of all the services. So there is a limit to what politicians can deliver, what the slum leaders can deliver. So it is important to understand the the nature of goals, the incentives, the networks of these actors, and what sorts of activities do they engage in. But the problem is that the systematic evidence is lacking on the vast range of conditions within and across slums. There is little information available to devise evidence-based policies for improving the well-being and urban poverty reduction by taking into account the varying needs of the people in slums. And today we have with us Dr. Adam Orbach to deliberate on some of these issues. And also we have with us Dr. Lalita Kamath and Dr. Pushpa Pathak as discussion. So we really look forward to listen to today's speakers and the discussions to understand some of the complexities which are inherent in of these Indian slums. So with these few words, let me now once again welcome to all the panelists and today's speaker for attending today's City Conversation series. And now let me now invite Dr. Adam to start his presentation. It's over to you, Dr. Adam.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the introductions, and good morning, everybody, from a very rainy Washington, D.C. But it's so exciting to be here with you all. And please let me start by thanking Dr. Arjun Kumar, Dr. Soumyadeep Chattopadhyay, and the entire IMPRI team, for not only organizing this event, but this entire series on the state of cities, which I've learned so much from, listening to past conversations. And it's a real honor to be able to contribute to that conversation today. Please let me also thank Dr. Lalita Kamath and Dr. Pushpa Pathak for joining us. It's also a real honor to be here with both of you, and I can't wait to hear your comments on what I've shared in my presentation today. So as the title suggests, and as Dr. Chattopadhyay suggested, what I'll be talking about today is the emergence and role of informal leadership, Basti Netas, in India's slum settlements, and how that is tied to community level development. And what I'll be presenting on is based on what is now about 10 years of field work and research and writing on these subjects. So very much looking forward to sharing this with you all. Okay. So just to provide a quick roadmap of where I'd like to go in the next 20-25 minutes or so. First, I'll provide a very brief overview of my forthcoming co-authored book, Migrants and Machine Politics: How India's Urban Poor Seek Representation and Responsiveness. And this is co-authored with Tarak Tachel, who's based at the University of Pennsylvania. Much of the data from the presentation comes from Migrants and Machine Politics, and what is now 8 years of collaborative fieldwork, survey research, and writing with Tarak. After introducing our book, I'll turn to the specific themes of today's presentation, understanding how informal leadership is constructed in informal slum settlements, and especially the role of ordinary residents in that construction. I'll then turn to describing the activities of slum leaders, drawing on an original survey of 629 slum leaders across 110 slum settlements in Jaipur, Rajasthan, and Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts on why does this all matter in thinking about community level development, and in particular development interventions by organizations, municipalities, and the government within informal settlements. Okay. So yeah, here's the, we just recently got the book cover design. So here's Migrants and Machine Politics. It should be coming out in January or February of 2023 with Princeton University Press. The book is really centered on what is one of the most arresting demographic changes unfolding right now in the Global South. We've already crossed the 50% mark in terms of the percentage of people living in the Global South who are living in cities. And this is expected to increase to 64% just within the next 3 decades. And staggeringly, 86% of global population growth in that same time span will be occurring not only within the Global South, but within cities in the Global South, especially within Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Everyone on the call certainly knows, much of this urbanization is marked by pervasive forms of informality, both in terms of housing and in terms of economic activity. So UN Habitat estimates that just under 1 billion people worldwide reside in slum or squatter settlements, areas with little or no strength of property rights, marginalized access to basic public goods and services, dense living conditions, often on environmentally sensitive lands. In Sub-Saharan Africa, it's estimated that 62% of people living in cities reside in slum settlements. And in South Asia, that number is estimated to be about 35%. In terms of economic activity, much of this urban population is understood to work in the informal sector, with little regulatory oversights, very little in the way of security of wages, and little or no social protections. In terms of the picture in India, and certainly these numbers are quite dated now, drawing on the census of 2011, but I think we can all agree that India's urban population now certainly exceeds 400 million people, more than a third of the population. It's estimated that about half of India's population will live in cities by 2050. And in that time span, India will be adding 416 million urban dwellers. And this is the largest projected increase in the world in absolute numbers. In India, cities too are marked by widespread informality. Again, drawing on the census of 2011, it's estimated that about 65 million people live in India's slum settlements, and the vast majority of those residents are toiling in the informal sector. So our book is framed around the following question: how are poor migrants coming from the countryside moving to cities to experience that socioeconomic upward mobility, contributing to this rapid urbanization? How are they being, if at all, politically incorporated into India's cities? And what we argue in our book is that this is a question that really sits at the heart of the future and current state of India's democracy. Each chapter of our book takes an analytical slice and understanding a distinct arena of politics in the formation of political networks that once poor migrants move and are setting up or living within squatter settlements in particular. So in Jaipur and Bhopal, these are referred to as Kachi Bastis, Jhuggi Jhopris in Delhi, Zoprapatis in Mumbai. How do political networks form within these communities after the dust of squatting settles? And then how do networks form, if at all, between these settlements and the wider world of urban politics in the city? So what I'll be discussing today are findings from chapter 2 of our book primarily. And chapter 2 asks, once the dust of squatting settles, how does informal leadership emerge within India's urban slums? What preferences do residents have over who their slum leaders are? And through what processes, if any, can they actually express those preferences in selecting who is their local informal leader? Just to give you a sense of where the other chapters go before turning into chapter 2, chapter 3 then sort of inverts the arrow downward. Once slum leaders emerge, what are the determinants of their downward responsiveness to the needs of residents in their communities? If you spend time in these communities, they're very much marginalized in terms of access to basic public goods and services. Residents are oftentimes turning to their informal leaders to gain access to goods and services. But with limited time and in the context of widespread material deprivation, slum leaders need to decide who am I going to privilege and who am I not going to privilege. And so chapter 3 seeks to disentangle why they're unevenly responsive to different resident claims. Chapter 4 then takes a step outside of the settlement and asks, how do political elites, politicians in the city, how do they decide among the small army of slum leaders in any sort of corner of their constituency to absorb within their political party organizations? And so, within Jaipur and Bhopal, we're really talking about the BJP and the Congress. Who are they going to give party positions, PUDs, to in their party, and make them padadikari, position holding party workers within the party organization. The final chapter then asks, given the sort of everyday claims that bubble upward from slum settlements to gain access to goods and services, why are politicians responsive to some claims made by these neighborhoods and their constituencies and not others? The book itself is based on over 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork in Kutchi Bastis in Bhopal and Jaipur. A number of surveys, so 2 waves of surveys of ordinary residents, the first across 80 slum settlements in Jaipur and Bhopal, and the second across 110 settlements. A survey of 629 informal slum leaders, and also a survey of municipal politicians in Jaipur and Bhopal, 343. We also did hundreds of open-ended interviews with these same sets of actors. And in addition to that, we collected several thousand what we call informal archival documents, things that are typically held within Kutchi Bastis. So these would be petitions for goods and services, community meeting notes, and various political ephemera that oftentimes would stretch back to the 1960s and 1970s that really gave us an up-close view on the micro histories of these neighborhoods, especially in combination with our open-ended interviews. Okay, so I'd like to turn now to describing India's slum leaders themselves. So just to give you an example, and of course I've changed the names of these actors and settlements. Not far from Jaipur's train station is a settlement that's referred to as Mazdoor Nagar. And to give you an example of one of these, of a slum leader, of a Basti Neta, this is Mr. Qureshi. Mr. Qureshi runs a Kirana Dukan, a general store in his neighborhood, where he sells basic provisions. But what his real main job is that he's an informal leader in the community. On an everyday basis, residents are turning to him to gain access to the state. So this one resident you can see in this picture is asking Mr. Qureshi to help him get access to a ration card, to get subsidized access to food and fuel. Mr. Qureshi also helps people in the community get access to water taps, electricity connections, after the monsoon, paving over potholes. During elections then, Mr. Qureshi mobilizes residents behind the political party that he's attached to, the Congress Party. Mr. Qureshi is the Upadhyaksh, the vice president of the Congress Party in his particular ward. And so in between elections, he's doing all these problem-solving activities for residents. But then he takes those networks that he's built through his own entrepreneurial sweat and converts them into mobilizational capacity for his party during elections. So more generally, India's slum leaders, these are non-state actors. They're not formally elected in formal elections. They're not agents of the state. They're non-state actors. They emerge from within settlements. They move to the settlements like any other resident in the community. And because of certain characteristics that I'll be outlining later in the presentation, other residents gravitate towards them because of their problem-solving capacity. And what we learned from our survey too is that almost none of these informal actors sort of had plans to go into politics when they move to the settlements. So this is something that very much happens after the settlement forms. As I just noted, they spearhead efforts to improve local conditions, also mobilizing residents during elections and rallies. And as I'll show you with the survey data from the 629 slum leaders that we've surveyed, most of them have a position, a PUD, within a party organization. So to provide some more concrete numbers, these actors are absolutely pervasive. Across the 110 slum settlements in our sample, 70% of residents acknowledged informal leadership in the settlements. Most of those who did not acknowledge them, it was more of an assessment of the quality of leadership, not evidence of their absence. But in only 3 of 110 settlements did we not have a single respondent acknowledge informal leadership. So you can essentially assume, again, at least within Jaipur and Bhopal and certainly other cities that we visited, that there will be informal leadership in the vast majority of settlements. Not only is informal leadership pervasive across settlements, but it's also multifocal within settlements. It's extremely rare for there to just be one informal slum leader in a settlement, even in a quite small settlement. we enumerated 664 party workers across these 110 slum settlements, and there were over 1,200 acknowledged informal leaders with varying levels of popularity across the 110 slum settlements. They're also really important for problem solving. Just over 65% of residents said that either they themselves or a member of their family turned to a Basti Neta, turned to a slum leader to seek help with a problem. And much of this stems from the difficulty of ordinary residents approaching the state by themselves. An earlier survey that I conducted for my first book that came out a few years ago, I asked residents if you went by yourself to a government official or a politician to ask for help, would you get attention? Only 12% of residents believe that they would actually be able to get the attention of people in the municipality, of the district collector, politicians by themselves. There's a great deal of despondency in their expectations of state responsiveness when it's not being mediated by an informal slum leader. So this drives much of the demand for these actors to serve in that intermediary role between ordinary residents and the state. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is describe how do these actors actually emerge. There's a really vibrant and rich literature, certainly on urban informality in India. Many people on the call have richly contributed to that literature and have mentioned and have studied informal slum leadership. There's much less work though done on historicizing how these actors actually come to be and what the preferences of residents are and how they are selected. So in India's urban slum settlements, first of all, these are extremely diverse spaces in terms of jati, in terms of religion, and in terms of state of origin. I mean, just to give you a sense of that, social scientists oftentimes rely on a measure called a fractionalization index, which is bound between 0 and 1, and it represents the probability that two randomly selected people in that group belong to a different group. And so the ELF measure, the fractionalization score for jati, for instance, and across our 110 sampled slum settlements is 0.8. That means there's an 80% chance in the average settlement that if you randomly pick two people from the community, they would be from a different jati. That's extremely diverse. It's just under 20% for religion. So most settlements in our sample have both, and this is predominantly Hindus and Muslims living next to one another in the same neighborhood. And it's even higher number, around 30% for state of origin, two randomly selected people having migrated from a different states. So these are extremely diverse spaces where hereditary titles or customary authority that might be hold some degree of social currency in the villages where people have migrated from are no longer relevant in the city. And so informal leadership has to be constructed from scratch when these communities first come up off the ground. As I noted, slum leadership is multifocal, it's contested. Slum leaders compete with one another intensely between and during elections, even within the same party, to have the biggest following. And so because of this competition and because of the novel nature of informal leadership in these communities, what we find both qualitative and quantitative evidence for is that residents have significant political agency in who they turn to seek help and follow. We also find that parties they're not sort of dispatching people to go live in slum settlements to represent the party. They also can't simply tap somebody in the neighborhood and say, now you are the neta. That process very much happens internally. And then political party leaders outside of the settlements will seek to sort of latch on to informal leaders that have already sort of emerged from within the neighborhood itself. So because of this, we argue a key analytical concern are resident preferences for informal slum leadership. So just to give you a sense from some of the interviews that we did, this is very representative of sort of the corpus of interviews that we've collected. As one resident noted, slum leaders help us because the residents of the Basti have chosen them as their leader. Slum leaders help the poor people who have no one in government to go to. We have chosen them for a reason. The slum leaders live among us, so it is their responsibility to help someone who approaches them with a problem. We have chosen them as leaders because they have information and knowledge. They should get our work done. Political party elites in the BJP and the Congress said very similar things. As one party elite told us, see, there's always leaders in the Bastis. Some people who are active and working for people. Our party needed someone like this in the settlement. It was through such people that we strengthened our position in the busties. These are the individuals we would select for a party position. Another political elite. See, someone from the community emerges as a strong leader, has a public following, has a strong influence. In that case, we must approach him and offer him a position. Third, we can't make someone a neta just by giving them neta clothes and making them stand on the road. In that case, he would just be a murti, a statue. They must have the support of residents. So through our qualitative fieldwork, we identified two key pathways through which informal leaders are selected. The first pathway are these episodic discrete events where large groups of people in a settlement come together, sometimes in sort of a betak, coming and sitting in a circle, sometimes in a larger crowd, to deliberate and discuss who is best fit to be our neta. And in some cases, this takes the form of an actual informal community election where they come up with paper ballots on their own. 50% of our survey respondents across the 110 slum settlements who acknowledge informal leadership said that they had selected those leaders in these sorts of group meetings. And 38% of our sampled slum leaders acknowledged that they were selected in these sorts of ways. So to give you a concrete example, one of the communities that I spent 3 or 4 months in of ethnographic fieldwork in Eastern Jaipur, Saraswati Basti. In the late 2000s, Saraswati was under threat of eviction because the settlement is settled on Van Vibhag, on forest department land. And so people in the community got together and decided we need an adyaksh, a president, a Basti Neta to help lead and push back against the eviction attempts. 3 residents came forward and the community set up an informal election with actual paper ballots, ballot boxes, candidates gave speeches, and Jagdish defeated Prem by 141 votes and became the adyaksh of the Basti. And this is, some images of, after the victory. He then went to choose the other members of the Vikas Samiti of the Development Association, and they're promising before residents to help them gain Vikas, development for the community. So there are these episodic events that take those forms. There is also another pathway that's much more everyday, much more fluid. These are the everyday choices of individual residents over who among the existing crop of informal leaders in my community am I going to turn to for help? Who am I going to follow? And this then determines the distribution of supports for informal leaders across the community. So really capturing the fluidity of these decisions is this following interview quote. There is one neta who people stopped following after I came to the slum because I knew more than him. I knew everything about the system. Whether you go to the Public Health and Engineering Department, the Municipal Corporation, the Electricity Board, the Jaipur Development Authority, or the Collectorate, I knew how to solve these problems related to the departments. Hence, that leader became most popular. So a new individual moves to the settlements, starts growing a following. More people turn to him because of his ability and know-how in navigating the states, and the following of the previous neta in that corner of the neighborhood atrophied. Okay, so I've just motivated the fact that residents actually have significant scope for selecting who their informal leaders are. So what then do they look for in their informal leaders? So to examine this, we conducted a conjoint survey experiment with just under 2,200 residents across the 110 slum settlements in Bhopal and Jaipur. And if you're interested in looking more closely at the findings, they're published in a 2018 article in the American Political Science Review, and a revised and extended version of that chapter is chapter 2 of our book. So just to give you a very quick summary of the findings, because I want to get on to why I think this all matters, of course, for community development efforts in these neighborhoods. So first and foremost, we find strong experimental evidence that education is especially important preference for residents, for slum leaders. That residents want slum leaders who are well educated because this underwrites their ability to navigate the state and to engage in petition writing, which is really sort of a cornerstone of claim making in these communities. So as 2 residents told us, see, you need 2 things to become a slum leader, Jagruta and Jankari. These qualities are needed to solve problems. Here in the slum, we have only poor people. Most people are uneducated. When there's an issue, they need help writing applications. They come to me and say, bye, brother, fill out this application. Slowly, people told others that I do this work. That's how I built my support. So education is crucial in informing preferences over who is going to be an informal slum leader. We also find experimental evidence that residents prefer leaders that have some sort of modest connectivity to the Nagar Nigam, to the municipality. And this usually takes the form of some sort of modest occupational connectivity. That individual is a chaprasi in the municipality, a municipal clerk, or they are a chokidar for the municipality, a guard, or they are a safai karamchari for the municipality, so a municipal sweeper. Modest public jobs, but ones that have that connection to the municipality that can help facilitate claim-making efforts for residents. So as one resident told us, even if a man is just a chokidar, a security guard at the municipal office, his bosses will be important people he sees every day. So if he asks them to make sure the municipality sends sweepers to clean our gutters, won't it be more likely that they listen to him? We also find experimental evidence that residents prefer leaders that do belong to their own jati, religion, and state. But interestingly, because these communities are so incredibly diverse, it is actually quite uncommon for a resident to have someone of their own jati who is an informal leader. So only 30% of our sampled residents actually had someone of their jati who was an informal slum leader. So the vast majority of people are turning to people other than their own jati to get help. So there might be sort of a generalized preference to have someone of your jati as a slum leader, but most people don't in practice actually have one. And so they're turning to people of jatis other than their own. And then a final preference that we find through our experimental, through our experiments is that residents do prefer co-partisans. So if you support the BJP, you prefer a BJP slum leader. And if you are Congress, you prefer to have a Congress slum leader. Okay, so I mean, just quickly in these last few minutes, we didn't just want to hang our hat on our experimental findings. We wanted to actually sample slum leaders and see how are they actually systematically different from ordinary residents in these communities. So I'd be happy to talk more about this if people are interested, but what we do is we end up surveying 629 slum leaders, which is a response rate of about 70% across these 110 slum settlements. And we argue that this is quite representative of the population of slum leaders in Jaipur and Bhopal, at least. Just to give you some descriptive statistics, the 629 slum leaders are incredibly diverse, just like the communities that they come from. They represent 160 different jati. They are religiously diverse. Just over 70% were Hindu, about 27% were Muslim. Overwhelmingly, they're from Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, the two states where Jaipur and Bhopal are, of course, situated within. They are mostly men, and I'll briefly discuss some of our findings on women slum leaders, but about 88% are men. And the vast majority are affiliated with either the Congress Party or the BJP. Just like what we found in our experimental findings, slum leaders are indeed, on average, significantly more educated than your ordinary residents. They're educated for just over eight years of formal schooling, which compares to about 5 years of formal schooling for your ordinary resident in the community. 90% of sampled slum leaders were literate, compared to about 62% of ordinary residents. And slum leaders are also twice as likely to have some amount of college education. So just under 20% of our slum leaders had at least a year of college education. In terms of that connectivity, that occupational connectivity to the municipality, we find that slum leaders are roughly 4 times more likely to have a high status job that puts them in some degree of proximity to power centers within the city. I had mentioned that residents do have preferences for co-ethnic slum leaders, but they oftentimes don't have the opportunity to do so. One other interesting sort of data point on this is that we asked our sampled slum leaders, can you please name the jati of the last 5 people that have come to you to ask for help? 77% gave at least one resident out of the last 5 that have come to them that belongs to a jati other than their own. In the 79 of the 110 slum settlements in our sample that have both Hindus and Muslims within them, 46% of slum leaders reported to have multi-religious client bases. So clearly residents who are Muslim are turning to Hindu slum leaders, residents who are Hindu are turning to Muslim slum leaders, really sort of underscoring the importance of what is the degree of efficacy that a leader can have in helping to solve problems, that people are very much willing to overlook differences in religion or jati if they're going to be getting help and effective help from someone. Just quickly, and I'd be happy to talk more about this if people are interested, but so it's only 12% of our sample of slum leaders are women. But during my 2 years of qualitative work for the project, many of the female slum leaders were many of the most firebrand slum leaders that I encountered during my field work. In at least half of the slum settlements that we sampled, there was at least one female slum leader. 75% of them have a position within a party, many of them within the Mahila Morcha, the women's wing within the Congress or BJP. No female slum leaders described being homemakers. They overwhelmingly have some sort of job, which is very different from your ordinary female residents in the communities. They're much more likely to have some sort of modest public job or have some sort of small business than ordinary women in the communities. They're less educated than male slum leaders. And interestingly, they're significantly more likely to be widows. 20% of the female slum leaders in our sample were widows, compared to 7% of female residents. Okay, so just to quickly wrap up, and then I'll get to the conclusion. And I've already sort of described this in other ways, but through our survey data, we find that slum leaders are doing a variety of activities. They're helping people get ration cards, voter ID cards, BPL cards, organizing money collections for residents who get sick or hurt or go to the hospital, organizing community meetings to discuss developments, resolving disputes, dealing with the police, making claims, spreading information about public programs. So there's a huge menu of activities that they do. Why do they do this? Well, for lots of different reasons that emerge from our qualitative fieldwork. First, they're gaining ordinary rents from everyday rents from residents. So when someone comes to you asking for help to get a ration card, oftentimes they're asking for, say, 200, 300, 400 rupees for that help. And when you ask slum leaders about that, they'll say, well, if I'm going to spend several hours at the district collector's office helping somebody get something, why should I not be compensated for that? But there's this everyday sort of stream of rents that they get for problem solving in the community. During elections, popular slum leaders make handsome amounts of money from political parties, sometimes the equivalent of several months of income for other residents in their community. Many of them are extremely ambitious. This is one of the subjects that we touch on in our book. Many of them are not just satisfied with being a bastineta forever. They want to get a ticket to fight in the municipal election. And so that they know that doing these sort of netagiri activities, these problem-solving activities, will propel them upward within the party and hopefully give them a position. And then finally, and this cannot be overlooked, slum leaders are residents of the settlement. They live with their families. They are also facing eviction. They're also facing underdevelopment. And so many of them would articulate what some of the reasons why they do leadership activities, because it immediately benefits them and their families and their neighbors and friends within the community. So just some concluding thoughts. So first, our book really underscores the fact that residents of India slums really have substantial political agency in selecting who are their informal slum leaders. These are actors that are not imposed on them from above. This is not to suggest that informal slum leaders are not doing anything that we might sort of construe as gundagiri. But these are not, the picture of informal leaders that we render in our book based on several years of fieldwork is not the image of the gang leader popularized in film and media. These are much more complex actors that are certainly getting many things for doing slum leadership, but in the process are seeking to improve their communities. Both our ethnographic and experimental findings show that non-ethnic, so non-jati, non-religious indicators of a slum leader's efficacy, especially their education, can trump preferences for co-ethnicity. So education itself is the most important attribute that slum leaders look for, that residents look for in their slum leaders. And then finally, a proliferating sort of framework of development right now is community-driven development, harnessing local participation, harnessing local associational life in local community development projects. And this is certainly something that's proliferating within India cities as well. If you read, for instance, during the height of my field work in the early 2010s, Rajiva Wasyojana was unfolding. There's an entire sort of booklet about how municipalities should be engaging the participation of communities in coming up with community maps, coming up with community preferences over what sort of projects that they want. And so what we argue, and is an implication of our finding, is that it's really essential in understanding what are the factors that underpin informal leadership. These are actors that oftentimes enjoy significant legitimacy in communities, and they're very unlikely to be sort of swept aside or circumvented by external agencies that want to, for instance, create a new community-based organization from scratch. So again, to go back to Rajiva Wasyojana, part of the booklet explicitly says that CBOs, community-based organizations, should not be led by people that are connected to political parties. That effort to sort of depoliticize local development in these communities is in many ways sort of glazing over the nature and crystallized forms of informal leadership in these communities that are otherwise assisting residents in a quotidian, everyday basis. If these leaders are so important, and we certainly believe that they are, it also suggests the need to understand who are they responsive to. That if you are an organization seeking to do development in these neighborhoods, perhaps it's best to understand who is being left out from the responsiveness of informal slum leaders. So clearly, women are dramatically underrepresented among the numbers of slum leaders. And there's, of course, a large literature suggesting that has many detrimental effects in terms of advancing the interests of women. We also find, this is in chapter 3 of our book, that slum leaders target co-partisans. So if you sort of belong to a party that's not in power and it's not represented by your slum leader, you could be marginalized. And they target residents who are best positioned to boost their own reputations within the community. So especially if you're a new resident or you're otherwise not really well socially connected within the community, you can often be marginalized. And then one final comment, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. The politics that we describe in our book is a politics that's highly fragmented. This is community level organization. These are individual slum leaders making claims on behalf of their neighborhoods. There's very little inter-settlement organization. I mean, the last time that I really observed this in Jaipur and Bhopal was reading about the Communist Party, especially in Bhopal in the 1960s and 70s, seeking to organize people as a larger class in the city. The politics of in informal settlements, at least in Jaipur and Bhopal, are highly fragmented. And so this is unlikely to yield larger programmatic changes to benefit the urban poor as a class who are living in informal settlements. So there's also a real need for sort of inter-settlement organization to push for these larger changes. But yeah, I'll leave it there, but thank you all so much for listening to the presentation. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Adam, for this sort of revealing portrait of local claim making and the problem-solving networks in India's urban slums. And regarding the emergence of the slum leaders, your arguments provide a refreshing change from these traditional studies of violence and these typical patron-client relationship which we found in the literature. The performance of the slum leaders, it appears that that do matter. The slum residents are actively selecting their brokers to represent their political interest and to convincingly make claims in the city, which of course entails significant implications for the representativeness or the inclusiveness, especially who is represented and responded to within these informal networks. And also it seems that this brokered nature of interventions are heavily tilted towards everyday problem solving. Much less attention is paid to the say some of the larger policy issues, for example, how to make the urban policies truly inclusive. But yes, this is really a very nice presentation, and there are lots of finer points which have emerged from your presentation. And let me now request our discussion today to share their comments on your presentation. So let me first invite Dr. Kamath to please share your views. It's over to you, Dr.
Okay, thank you so much, Samyadeep. And Adam, thank you so much for that presentation. It was most insightful. There are many things I think I really enjoyed about the work. I will confine myself here, however, to just maybe two main points. One of the things that I really liked is, I think, the focus on the agency of people in preferring certain brokers. And it's also very much also the story of broker agency. And here very much showcasing the power of alternative narratives, explaining the rise of slum leaders. What's particularly interesting here is that you also give us a sense of the diversity, the plurality of these kinds of stories and pathways. And that, I think, is something also really worthwhile because I think that's something that all researchers really have to grapple with, you know, the sheer diversity of the kind. So how do you then in some ways fix? So I think that leads me to the second point that I really enjoyed about the presentation is, I think, a great use of methodologies, mixed methodologies, where you very productively combine then a survey plus interviews. And I think at a larger level, what this does for me is really, it initiates and extends a conversation between larger fields and disciplines of political science and anthropology. I think there's always been much too little debate and sort of cross-pollination of ideas across disciplines, across subfields, across academicians and practitioners. And so I think, again, the move that you make in this work to do that is really commendable. So moving on to a few comments and sort of questions that emerge out of the work. Most of them are based on my own research and what I know of through second-hand and third-hand versions of Indian cities. The first is really that the study that you do takes as its point of departure individual slum leaders and how they come to be. And in fact, you nicely detail out how such leaders operate within broader networks of relations. You look at vertical, sort of the above to the party hierarchy, and you didn't focus on that today, but I'm sure you pointed out that it's part of another chapter. Apart from the vertical set of network of relations, you also then look at the horizontal, the relations with other community residents and potentially other leaders. So that was, I think, very nicely and neatly done. What I'm actually wondering here is there a spatial and temporal dimension to this work that I think you can more usefully bring out? For example, spatial embedding in a neighborhood, I think, is extremely critical. I'm also saying this coming from the discipline broadly of urban planning and urban policy, where space is very critical. But I do think the spatial embedding in a neighborhood, thinking about the history of settlement of particular bastis, and not just the history of the particular basti, but also its growth over time with respect to the city, the larger city's political economy. I think that is really crucial. And I do think that could be more usefully focused on and attended to. For example, then I think it would be some maybe more interesting patterns could emerge in terms of newer slums, peripheries versus older core city slums. It would also shape, for example, whether leaders fix problems for only co-ethnics, because it depends then on the heterogeneity of the nature of the basti. I mean, because if the basti is much more homogeneous, then, so it depends on, I think, more of these. So maybe I think putting some of your interview work more in conversation with the survey work would help to detail out some of these patterns. The second broad thing that I wanted to actually highlight is really the question, which is a very, very important question that you raise in the work, of knowledge of brokerage. And really, the question it brings to mind very sharply is, what sort of knowing and knowledge is this? And you, in fact, squarely put some attention there. But I think you focus much more on education, and you use education as a proxy for this, talking about things like awareness, information. And I think this is where I disagree with you, or at least I would push you to sort of expand a little bit more, because I think when I think about this idea of knowledge of brokerage or knowledge of slum leaders, is it that people actually want a different kind of knowledge and a different way of knowing that's connected to how to get things done? And can that kind of knowledge actually be conferred through formal education in a classroom, for example, which is how most people think of education? So is this in fact a different kind of knowledge, a different kind of way of knowing? Maybe one can call it more tacit knowledge, something that's in fact learned through experience, through practical knowledge, learning through in fact practice networks, And so definitely built up over time, maybe collaboratively as well. So I think maybe what could be useful here is to reflect a little on the spectrum of knowing, from formal knowledge conferred by education, which I think definitely is important and has a place here, to then the practical knowledge conferred by experience. But I think maybe not to completely silence that part, because I think it's in fact very critical. The third point I wanted to highlight is really, again, the big question that you raised is, why do slum leaders do this work? What words, in fact, I want to ask you here is, what words do they use to explain why they do this work? And I'm particularly asking you this because in a lot of the work that I've done, I found that explanations are often given using terms and issues like doing social service, samaj seva, contributing to something larger than just themselves or their families. And so I think there's something of this also at play here. It's certainly shaded by many other more instrumental and individualistic views. But I think there is, again, some kind of a tension here between the instrumentalist and individualist view, with one that is more embedded in a particular context, and the sort of the web of broader social relations, maybe even connections to ideas around sort of larger values like justice. These terms might not be used often in, a similar word of justice might not be used, but the value, the structure of feeling, I think very much is communicated. So again, this tension, I think, is productive and maybe can be dwelt on more. The fourth point I want to make, which is sort of leading me to the conclusion of what I wanted to say, is that what is the future, I think, of such slum leadership and such brokerage? What are the emerging trajectories, the possibilities, as well as maybe even more importantly, the limits? And I'm asking this particularly because you highlighted in your last point, I think, the fragmented nature of the politics. And I think Soumyadeep also very usefully highlighted this difference between everyday service delivery, everyday problems versus a more longer term sort of structural set of issues. And I think this is really maybe then where we need to look at far more closely. I think particularly in the current context that we are looking at, for example, if we look at larger cities, you see increasingly real estate development and state capitalist forces are colonizing bastis for the land on which they sit. And in the commodification of land, slum leaders, in fact, play crucial roles as intermediaries. And this is a range, again, a range of responses. So it's not a singular role. There is participation and collusion. There is also overt resistance against the market entering and displacing other local economies. So leaders are also complicit in their community's own dying and fragmentation. But this happens in very differentiated and uneven ways. So I think then the question for me is, are smaller cities different? And I think what's really useful is your work highlights smaller cities. So maybe you can dwell a little bit more on this. What role then does the real estate economy and commodification of land play here vis-a-vis slum leadership? And then how does, of course, it in turn shape the preferences of residents? And maybe also to think of this also in the context of growing majoritarian politics, which is again something which we need to really contend with. So finally, I'm going to leave it here, but to sort of say that this leads me to really then say, what are the limits, the structural limits of resident agency in expressing their preferences for individual slum leaders? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kamath, for raising so many important issues. So I'm sure Dr. Adam will respond to these very interesting questions. And before that, let me now invite Dr. Pathak to please share your thoughts on today's presentation. So what do you, Dr. Pathak?
Please unmute yourself.
Please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you, Soumyadeep, and thank you, Adam, very much for that interesting presentation. In some ways, the story seems very familiar and would be applicable to slums across many cities in India. But in some ways, it seems quite particular to second-level cities or smaller cities that you have covered. What I find interesting is that you have looked at kachi bastis, And I'm presuming they are non-secure, non-tenure secure status slums. So consciously, you have chosen less secure slum status in your sample. Was that a conscious choice, or you wanted to look at differences across different types of slums with more secure and less secure tenure status? That's a question to my mind, because tenure status doesn't even appear as one of the activities of the slum leaders. So that's one question centered around the tenure status of the sample that you have selected, and if you could dwell on that. The second question that I have is around the nature of slum leadership itself that evolves over time. So is the slum leadership a permanent status, or residents reassess over a period of time if they have been successful or not successful in responding to their needs, and they change their leaders? So this is the long-term leadership status in these localities, and what kind of role residents play, and how do they express themselves in choosing new leaders? So that's the second set of questions that are centered around the over time temporal nature of these leadership. The third set of questions is that the political aspirations of these leaders themselves, as you have said, and that's very interesting and quite normal, that slum leaders want to have a greater say and a greater position in the governance structure of the city, be it ward level, be it municipal level. So in your cases that you have studied, were there any examples that slum leaders actually got into local governance or acquired position other than party positions in municipal structure at some level or the other, either ward level or selected municipal councillors? So was their aspiration fulfilled as they desired? So I would leave my three sets of questions for Adam to dwell on, and it will be very interesting to hear the discussion that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pathak. And let me now straightly move over to Dr. Adam for a response to all the queries, all the views which are presented, which are mentioned by our discussion. So it's over to you, Dr. Adam.
Thank you. And I mean, please let me start by, just thank you so much for those absolutely fascinating questions to both the discussants, all immensely important. So I think I'll start with the most recent question and move backwards from that. So Dr. Pathak, yes, we show, and this is a focus of chapter 4 of our book, that these aspirations, certainly to move up within the party organization, are realized by many slum leaders. Moving up in their positions, from the booth level to the ward, to the block or mandal, to the sheher, to the district. They move up within the party organization. Many do actually end up getting a party ticket, especially those that are residing in Kachi Bastis that are very large, that constitute almost, most of the ward's population. So some of our slum leaders in our sample do end up actually getting party tickets. Less aspirations, I think, being filled in terms of this launching them into a career outside of politics. Much of the connectivity that we discussed earlier was sort of an initial function of what propelled them into slum leadership, not something that they ultimately attained through slum leadership. So yeah, I think the short answer to that really important question is that there's significant political upward mobility for many of these informal slum leaders within party organizations. And leading some of them to getting a party ticket to fight in a municipal election. In terms of the status of slum leadership over time, it's really interestingly most certainly not permanent. it really rests on demonstrated efficacy in getting things done. And so especially in, and this is something that I really get into in my first book that came out a few years ago, when you trace the micro histories of these neighborhoods, there's a really interesting rise and fall in the political careers of different slum leaders, largely due to who in the existing sort of crop of slum leaders are being the most effective and people gravitating towards some over others. There's always new crops of younger residents that are sort of coming of age with sort of new skills, higher rates of education to break into slum leadership and challenge the informal authority of existing slum leaders. So there's a real churn, and much of that being underpinned by demonstrated efficacy in problem solving. So it's certainly something where you have to continue to demonstrate that, or you're really risking. In other instances in my ethnographic field work, some slum leaders, once they had this informal authority, would turn to using dadagiri, like forcefully using themselves to sort of push other people around. I saw many instances of residents explicitly punishing slum leaders who really sort of crossed the line and transgressed on residents, residents coming to their house with chapels or sort of stones to push back against transgressions. Again, speaking to the political agency of residents in this story. I'm so glad that you asked about the type of settlements, really important. We specifically focus on squatter settlements, settlements that emerge on greenfield sites, without any sort of land title. No one has a patta at first, of course, absolutely no goods or services, and differentiate those in our sample frame from old city slums. So in Jaipur and Bhopal, these would be in the Purana Shahar, neighborhoods that are in some instances several centuries old, that are quite dilapidated, sometimes colloquially referred to in Jaipur and Bhopal as kachi bastis, but they're fundamentally different than these squatter settlements that have emerged in the last 20, 30, 40 years throughout the city that are sort of classic squatter settlements. We also differentiate them from urban villages, from post-eviction resettlement colonies. So yeah, we spent quite a bit of time, not just sort of taking the lists from the cities and saying, this is the list of slums, we're just going to sample from them, being specific about sort of what type of neighborhood we're talking about. And because of that, as you suggested, because we focus on squatter settlements, kachi bastis, these are overwhelmingly sort of insecure spaces in terms of formalized property rights. Some neighborhoods have been regularized, and some have gotten actual sort of pattas. It gets even more complicated than that. I mean, in the 1980s, Arjun Singh, the chief minister of Madhya Pradesh, gave out sort of 1 and 30-year pattas, which have now long since lapsed, but people will still sort of hold on to them because it sort of gives them some sort of, address and footing in the neighborhood. So there's a whole sort of range. One of my colleagues, two of my colleagues, Anirudh Krishna and Emily Rains, do a really great job showing the sort of the many shades of gray between sort of not having any patta and having sort of a full title. But yeah, we specifically focus on squatter settlements. And your first comment on the size of cities, really important, right? One of the reasons why we focus on Jaipur and Bhopal is that most people living in slum settlements in India do not live in Mumbai and Delhi and Chennai and Bangalore and Kolkata. They live in these tier 2 cities in this huge constellation of smaller towns spread throughout the country. So in picking any particular city, or 1, 2, 3, however many it is, they're going to have some idiosyncrasies that make them a little bit different than other places. So for instance, Jaipur and Bhopal, this is BJP and Congress are the only game in town. If we had done our project in Uttar Pradesh or Bihar or West Bengal, there'd be a different, ecosystem of parties. But yeah, city size, of course, is very important in terms of state capacity, the extent of decentralization, the network of political parties, lots of things, so really stressing the importance of contextualizing the cities that we've selected. Dr. Kamath, again, absolutely fascinating questions. Yeah, the words that oftentimes that you would describe, if you just say kya karte hai, in terms of their actual sort of netagiri, many of them say that they're doing samaj seva, social work, understanding it as such. And I think it's easy to be sort of cynical and understanding that they're just sort of saying that, but they're getting all these material goods. But I don't think that can be minimized. Many of them understand their activities, at least in part, as improving their neighborhood, as its own end. So I think that can't be just, as you're suggesting, that's simply sort of dismissed. And also seeking out respect and dignity within their communities for themselves and people within their networks. Education, as you suggest, certainly goes beyond formal education. Literacy, the ability to read and write certainly is important in terms of the flurry of petitions that they write to the municipality or to politicians to get things for the settlement. So there are some, certainly, elements of that. But as you said, a lot of this is experiential. It's not something that you have a high school or college degree and suddenly you know how to go to the district collector's office and do everything. A lot of it is this sort of, entrepreneurial sweat, experiential knowledge, a grittiness that many of these individuals have that go beyond sort of formal education. So I really appreciate that point. That's something I think that we can expand upon much more in our work. I also deeply appreciate your suggestions to theorize more about sort of what's going on at the city level, not only just be in the weeds in the neighborhoods, but what's going on in the political economy of the city, the spatial nature of this. I have a sort of a newer project with a colleague of mine, Tanu Kumar, on the peripheries, at least of Jaipur and Bhopal, are not really even Kutchi Bastis anymore, as I sort of understood them in my earlier work. They are unauthorized colonies that are lower middle class, developed by private developers that are not authorized by the Vikas Pradhikaran, by the Development Authority, and they have their own politics to them. They're much more likely to be homogenous in terms of religion and jati. And so they're fundamentally different spaces than Kutchi Bastis. And I think that's just one example, of the importance of considering space and temporality. And then the last thing that I'll say is, yes, our entire conclusion of our book dwells on this grassroots politics that we're examining. What does this mean in sort of a post-2014 India? These multi-ethnic networks that we examine, not only in terms of jati, but in terms of religion, can we expect them to come under greater strain with Hindu majoritarianism, with arising discourses, a centralization of power in Delhi? What does that mean for sort of local brokerage and local sort of city politics? And so, yeah, we spend actually much of the final chapter sort of dwelling on these sort of thoughts. And I don't know, maybe hand wavy is not the right word, but it's sort of thinking about where this might be going in the future. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing, that with you and hearing what you think. But I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Adam, for your responses to almost all the queries which have been raised. And also, I'm saying that there are some questions in the Q&A box and also in the chat box. And one question is related to this Partha Chatterjee's thesis of survival politics of poor, which is I think Professor Tathagata Chatterjee has mentioned this particular question, like how the urban poor shift their political alignments, because obviously this is very much evident in our state, West Bengal. And did you see the similar pattern? This is the question from Professor Tathagata Chatterjee. And also there is another question from Dr. Sigdale. It's about the suggestions from you regarding the permanent solution on the issues of the slums or increment in the number of slums in the South Asia. And the third question is in the chat box. So it's from Arun Kumar, and this is about the slum leaders' ability to do violence or the perception of it. Did it play any role? Who gets established as the slum leader, either in Jaipur and Bhopal? And the second question is the importance of this caste or religion of these slum leaders on their ability to solve day-to-day problems. So your responses to some of these issues.
Arun Kumar ji is also here. Would you like to ask?
No, I think the question has been summarized pretty well by so many. It's okay.
All right, please go ahead, Dr.
And just another thing, I'm just saying that Shamala Mani has raised her hand. So,
Shamala, would you like?
Dental or just?
Not, I mean, actually,
Okay,
Arjun just wanted me to. Yeah, I come from an environmental background, Adam, and I was just interested to know whether, the slum leaders, of course, provide, this kind of services like, getting a ration card or getting an Aadhaar card or one of those things. But has the municipality or the municipal corporation ever tried to use the leaders for actual improvement of certain conditions or certain behavior or certain schemes, or to improve the slum, environmentally. So not only the residents using the netas for to get their work done, but has the municipality ever used the netas to actually improve the slums? That was my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mani. So yes, it's over to you.
Incredible questions. I mean, just to start with the last one, thank you for that. I've never seen anything that like really programmatically sort of bakes informal slum leadership sort of into explicit engagements with these communities. Usually the assumption is that we'll have to build sort of new community-based organizations or get the community together and have them sort of select somebody for these sort of one-off projects. But that said, I mean, there's something, much of the activities that I've explained are very informal, but there's a gray area in between. So whenever there's sort of Sarkari Chikitsa camps, government medical camps or ration card drives, the MLA of the area, people within the Nagar Nigam working in particular settlements, they have a very nuanced sense of who these slum leaders are, and will often be interfacing with them to mobilize residents and help with sort of setting it up. Much of that will have a political bent to it. But yeah, there's certainly a world between sort of these sort of quotidian bottom-up everyday politics and sort of more programmatic top-down policy and programs where slum leaders are sort of engaged, even if not explicitly so. Said so in the project. So it's a really fascinating question and for something to consider. In terms of Dr. Chatterjee's question, yeah, I mean, Partha Chatterjee's book on political society, his work on political society has of course been really important in our study. It's something that we engage a lot. I mean, one of the points that we're trying to make in the book is that yes, political society, parties, protests, brokers, very much are the things of politics in terms of getting things done. But one of the main points that we're trying to make in our book is that political society is not just the world. These brokers and parties are not just things that exist above the urban poor that they're using to gain access to the states. The urban poor, through their agency, are actively shaping the networks of political society by making these grassroots decisions, because then politicians need to rely on these decisions and the informal leaders that emerge within communities in their own structure of networks in the city. So what we're trying to sort of do is move beyond sort of this sort of generalized statements about how marginalized urban citizens get things done to saying that they're actually active participants in crafting these networks in the first place, with really important implications for really understanding in a nuanced sense who actually benefits from the states and who does not, and who's left off. So that's sort of how we sort of engage this. In terms of political alignment, about a third of our ordinary slum residents in our sample said that they've changed their votes for political parties over the last several elections. And we think that's probably an underestimate. So there's significant sort of swing voters in these neighborhoods of people sometimes voting for the BJP and sometimes voting for the Congress. Sorry, I just heard somebody weighing in. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, please carry on.
Yeah, so yeah, lots of sort of party switching, I know, and I want to be mindful of time and see if there's other questions too, but yeah, and in terms of, I mean, suggestions, I mean, this is obviously a huge question and a difficult thing to take on, in the last few minutes, but I mean, clearly, much of this is, a story of informality and, unauthorized status, lack of access to property rights, the precarity that is generated by that. And as we all know, it's largely a political problem, and this is obviously not unique to India. It sort of amazed me, in interviews and engagements with politicians, that they would oftentimes explicitly say that, look, we'll give people pani, we'll give people pakarasta, we'll give them a nali, but a patta, is something to worry about because it breaks that dependency relationship. Suddenly, they can gain access to these things a little bit easier. They're less reliant on me as the politician. And so it creates these sort of, unfortunate incentives of a low, of this equilibrium of an extension in precarity stemming from a lack of property rights. So I think, as many people have already sort of, examined in their own scholarship and policy work, this really sits at the core of a lot of this and larger sort of questions of gaining access to the city. I think that's, I think I'll leave it there, but thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adam. Like it's today's discussion has really been quite engaging, and today's talk gives insights into how the slums functions, both in terms of how the leaders are picked, ranging from discussion among the residents to their gradual emergence over time by mainly, as you mentioned, that demonstrating their ability to get things done, and also the agency that the residents enjoy. And this discussion also, I think, highlights the importance of understanding the nature and levels of political organization and agencies to frame suitable policies for addressing the slum vulnerabilities. Now, one thing is pretty clear, that we need to explore these relationships in more detail, these nuances in more detail, and with an open mind. And we hope to have you in our future City Conversation series as well. So with this thing, again, on behalf of the team IMPRI, I thank all the participants, and also especially Dr. Adam Orbach and Dr. Lalita Kamath and Dr. Pushpa Pathak for being here with us, sharing their views. And then now may I now request Arunima to formally propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you. As we come to the end of this extremely enlightening discussion, I, Arunima Marva, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi, would like to formally propose a vote of thanks on behalf of the Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies, IMPRI. We are grateful to our speaker, Dr. Adam Orbach, and our moderator, Dr. Soumyadeep Chattopadhyay, for taking out the time for being with us for this thought-provoking talk on informal leadership and development in India's urban slums. Thank you. We also thank our discussants, Dr. Pushpa Pathak and Dr. Lalita Kamath, for adding their diverse perspectives and valuable insights to this deliberation. And of course, we thank all our participants who are here on Zoom or on Facebook Live for participating, and also to our viewers who will be watching us later on YouTube or listening to our podcast. Thank you again, and I hope you continue to tune in on future episodes of #City Conversations series, as well as other lined up deliberations of IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Good night.
Thank you, and good night to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Pathak and Dr. Kamath also.
Thank you so much.